The 9th of January, 1887. Somewhere between the Solomon River and the Saline River in north-central Kansas, the cattle are already dead, 800 of them stacked against a barbed wire fence like a message nobody asked for, their hides frozen so stiff you could knock on them. The men who find them that morning can't get their horses close because the horses won't go. The temperature is somewhere around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At Bismarck, it will hit minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit before noon. At Fort Keogh in Montana, it will eventually reach minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest temperature anyone in the continental United States has ever formally recorded. The cowboys who survive this winter will talk about it for the rest of their lives. Theodore Roosevelt's ranches near Medora are being wiped out at this exact moment, and he doesn't know it yet. He's in the East. He'll find out by letter. When he does, he'll write to Henry Cabot Lodge. "We have had a perfect smash-up all through the cattle country of the Northwest." He never goes back to ranching seriously. The winter breaks him of it. Across the northern plains from Kansas to Montana, the established wisdom about shelter is being tested the hard way. Frame houses are failing. Thin-walled claim shanties, the kind that went up fast and looked fine in October, are proving themselves coffins. Even solid log cabins built to frontier standard are struggling. Men and women who survived the hard winter of 1880–81 are comparing it to this one and saying this one is worse, or at minimum different, more relentless, more sustained, less willing to give a day of recovery. But here, in the limestone hills of Russell County, Kansas, there is one house where a family is sitting around a fire that they barely have to tend. The walls are holding. The wind is hitting something outside and simply stopping. The temperature inside is somewhere around 58 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and it has barely moved in 3 days. A quarter-mile away, a neighbor's log cabin built the previous spring, built correctly, properly chinked, is so cold that the family inside can see their breath, and they've been burning furniture since yesterday. The difference between these two families on the 9th of January 1887 is not luck. It's not better firewood. It's not a bigger hearth. It's a single layer that most people, when they look at a stone wall, would never even notice. A layer so thin, so ordinary, so invisible in its function that the neighbor who built the same stone walls, with the same stone and the same mortar and the same dimensions, walked right past it every time. That's what this is about. 2 stories run through this video, and they look completely unrelated. The first is about a man named Johann Schreiber, a Volga German who arrived in Ellis County, Kansas in the spring of 1876 as part of one of the largest organized immigrant migrations the American plains had ever seen. He brought 2 things from Russia most other settlers didn't have: a trained stonemason's eye and a very specific memory of how his grandfather built walls. The second story is about a problem that building scientists in the 1970s and 1980s couldn't figure out: stone buildings that performed dramatically better than their measurements said they should. Researchers from the Building Research Establishment in the UK, from Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, from the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, kept running into the same anomaly. A stone wall with an R value of 2 was keeping people warm in temperatures that should have been killing them. Something in their calculations was wrong, but for a long time they couldn't say what. These 2 stories have the same answer, and when you understand it, you'll never look at a wall the same way again. Start with what you probably already know about how walls keep you warm. The standard explanation is insulation. A material resists the flow of heat, higher R value, better resistance, warmer inside. This is the framework that gets taught, that gets stamped onto product labels, that gets cited in every home improvement article you've ever read. A 6-inch softwood log wall gives you roughly R8/4. A 10-inch log wall pushes up to R10/7. A 2-4-inch limestone wall, solid, mortared. The kind of thing settlers spent a full summer building gives you about R2, maybe R2/7 on a good day with good stone. By those numbers, the log cabin wins by a lot. A 10-inch log wall has roughly 5 times the insulation resistance of 2 feet of solid stone. If the only thing that mattered was R value, then every one of those frontier stone builders was a fool, and the people who laughed at them were right. But here's what actually happened. On the morning of the 9th of January, 1887, across the northern plains, the cabins that lost the most people were the ones with the thinner walls and better measured insulation. The houses that held the ones where families survived with minimal fuel, where interior temperatures didn't swing catastrophically, were disproportionately heavy, massive, and sealed. R value doesn't explain that, which means R value isn't the whole story. Go back to Johann Schreiber for a moment. Back to 1876 and a train platform in Topeka, Kansas. The Volga Germans had been living in Russia for over 100 years. German-speaking colonists invited by Catherine the Great in 1763 to farm the Volga River region. They'd maintained their language, their church, their building traditions, their grain varieties. For generations, they were German farmers in a Russian landscape. Then, Tsar Alexander II revoked their special status in 1871, removed their exemptions from military service, and essentially told them the deal was over. Between 1874 and 1879, an estimated 15,000 Volga Germans came to Kansas. Most landed first in Kansas City or Topeka. From there, the land grants sent them west to Ellis County, Rush County, Trego County, into the heart of the same limestone belt that had been sitting just below the surface of the northern Kansas plains for 85 million years. The scouting party that arrived in 1874 included 5 men: Peter Leiker, Peter Stecklein, Anton Wasinger, Nicholas Shamney, and Jacob Ritter. They walked the territory on foot, looked at the soil, looked at what came out of the ground when they dug, and went back to Russia with their report. What they found, among other things, was rock, but not just any rock. The fence post limestone, the top layer of the Greenhorn Limestone Formation, ran in a band roughly 200 miles long across the north-central Kansas plains. It sat 1 to 3 feet below the surface, coming up in outcrops along creek banks and hillsides. It was between 8 and 12 inches thick. And here was the remarkable thing. When you pulled it out of the ground fresh, you could saw it. You could cut it with a handsaw. It was almost soft. Then it hardened. Left out in the air for a few weeks, it became the rock it was supposed to be. Weather-resistant, dense, and durable. When Johann Schreiber's group arrived in Ellis County in spring 1876, they did what every settler did first. Dug into a hillside for a dugout. Survival first. But Schreiber was watching the stone that came out of that hillside, and he was remembering something. His grandfather had built houses in the Volga region, not log houses, not sod houses, but stone houses. Schwarzdecker construction, the old men called it. Heavy walls, lime mortar. And one particular step at the end that Schreiber's grandfather had always insisted on, even when the others thought it was unnecessary. He plastered the inside. Not the outside, the inside. To understand why that mattered, you need to understand what a stone wall actually is. Picture a wall made of irregularly shaped stones, set in mortar. Each stone is a slightly different shape. The mortar fills the gaps. The whole thing is 20 inches thick, solid from outside to inside. From the exterior, it looks like a wall. From the interior, it looks like a wall, but it isn't airtight, not even close. Mortar joints have micro cracks. The bond between mortar and stone surface isn't perfect along every inch of every joint. The stones themselves or porous limestone will actually absorb water and release it, breathe slightly. In a wind, the differential pressure between outside and inside pushes cold air through hundreds of small pathways simultaneously, not a gust you can feel from across the room, but a constant, invisible exchange of warm interior air moving out and cold exterior air moving in, through every gap along every mortar joint, through every microfracture. People who own old stone houses describe it in exactly this way. One owner of an unplastered 19th century stone building said, "Standing near the wall on a very cold day, he could feel a faint breeze. He couldn't see any holes. The wall looked solid. But there it was, cold air pressing through. The National Park Service, in its Preservation Brief No. 3 on energy efficiency in historic buildings, put a number on this. Air infiltration accounts for 5 to 40% of total space conditioning costs in older buildings. That's a stunning range. In a bad case, an unplastered rubble stone wall, in a 40 miles per hour Kansas wind, you're losing close to half your heat, not through the wall material itself, but through the air moving through it. A log cabin, by comparison, is much more air resistant. The horizontal logs sit on top of each other in long, continuous runs. Chinking fills the gaps. There are far fewer penetration pathways. The log wall's thermal story is mostly a story about insulation resistance. The stone wall's thermal story is mostly a story about air. And this is where the analogy that comes to mind first. A thick sweater breaks down deliberately and instructively. A thick woolen sweater has roughly the same relationship to wind as an unplastered stone wall. Excellent thermal resistance and still air. Put it on a cold day with no wind and you're comfortable. But the second the wind picks up, that same sweater becomes useless. The air presses through every fiber. The sweater's R value, if you measured it in a lab at still air, would show something respectable. But in real conditions with wind, it fails. You know this from experience. Now put a thin nylon shell over it, a windbreaker, maybe 2 millimeters thick, an R value approaching 0, and suddenly you're warm again. That's what lime plaster does to a stone wall. It doesn't insulate it, it seals it. The plaster applied wet, pushed into every crack and pore and micro gap along the interior face, creates a continuous barrier against air movement. Once the air can't move through, the wall's mass becomes something useful. But that's getting ahead of the story. Back to Kansas. Back to Johann Schreiber, standing in front of his first proper stone house, which he finished in the fall of 1877. His neighbors had watched him build it. Several of them, mostly American-born settlers from Indiana and Ohio who'd been in the county a year or two longer, had opinions about what he was doing. A log cabin went up in days. Schreiber had been quarrying and hauling and shaping and laying for the better part of 6 months. He'd used a drill and wedge technique to split the fence post limestone from the outcrops along Buffalo Creek. Each stone came out in roughly the same thickness, 8 to 10 inches, because the natural bedding planes of the formation ran horizontally and consistently. He shaped them with a mason's hammer, getting rough, flat faces for the courses. He laid them in lime mortar. The lime he'd burned himself a kiln dug into the south face of a hill, limestone packed in with wood, 3 days of burning. Then the powder slaked with water until it became putty. The walls came up 2 skins of stone with a rubble core in the middle. The full wall thickness was 22 inches. He set bonder stones, long pieces that ran all the way through both faces every 3 feet vertically and every 4 feet horizontally, tying the inner and outer faces together so the wall moved as one thing. When the walls were finished, when the roof was on, when the window and door frames were set, Schreiber did the step his grandfather had always insisted on. He mixed a fresh batch of lime putty, a stiff, white paste, and he plastered the interior. Every surface, every wall, from floor to ceiling. He worked it into the joints with his hands first, pushing the paste into every gap he could find, then came back with a float and spread it smooth, a layer 3/4 of an inch thick. Let it carbonate, crack slightly in curing, went over it again with a finishing coat. His neighbor Carl Adler watched him do it and shook his head. "Why are you painting your walls white when you haven't got a door that closes properly yet?" Schreiber said, "The door I can fix later. This comes first." Adler thought it was an immigrant's superstition, old country habit that didn't mean anything here. He was building his own stone house, the same fence post limestone, the same courses, the same basic dimensions, and he saw no reason to plaster the interior. The stone looked fine, it was solid, and you could see it was solid. He left the interior face bare, like most of his American-born neighbors were doing. The winter of 1877 to 78 was cold, but not catastrophic. The winter of 1878 to 79 was worse. By 1880 to 81, the winter that Laura Ingalls Wilder would later call the Long Winter, the entire northern plains was in an extended siege. October 1880 through April 1881. Blizzard following blizzard at intervals of a few weeks. Temperatures at Omaha that November set records that still stand 35 degrees Fahrenheit in parts of Dakota Territory. Settlers grinding seed wheat in coffee mills because the trains had been blocked by snowdrifts for months and the supply wagons couldn't get through. Communities across the Dakotas and Nebraska and Kansas burning furniture and hay twisted into sticks because there was no coal and the wood was gone. Schreiber burned less fuel that winter than Carl Adler, who had the same size house made of the same stone. He kept a written record. German settlers tended to keep meticulous records, a habit from the organized colony life on the Volga, and his records show roughly 30 to 35% less wood consumed through the worst 6 weeks of that winter. Adler noticed. He asked about it in the spring. Schreiber showed him the interior plaster. Adler looked at it, ran his hand along the smooth white surface, and thought about it. "So it's the paint," he said. "It's not paint," Schreiber said. "Paint sits on the surface. This is pressed into the surface. It is the wall, not a cover for the wall." Adler went home and tried to plaster his interior with a mixture of clay and ash, what many settlers used when they couldn't afford a proper lime burn. It helped a little, but the clay dried, shrunk, cracked, fell away from the stone in chunks. The air gaps reopened within 2 seasons. In the spring of 1886, Schreiber rebuilt Adler's interior plaster coat properly. Real lime putty, the keyline burned batch, applied correctly, float finished, allowed to carbonate fully. That fall, the great die-up arrived. The winter of 1886 to 87 is still the worst documented cattle winter in American history. It actually began in the summer of 1886, though nobody recognized the warning. The summer had been unusually hot and dry across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota Territory. The grass was short, overgrazed for years by the cattle boom of the early 1880s, then scorched by a drought summer. The cattle went into fall underweight. Nobody sold them down. The market had been falling, and ranchers were waiting for a recovery that never came. The first blow landed the 16th of November, 1886, a 3-day blizzard that buried the northern range under 3 feet of snow and crusted the surface. The cattle began drifting south in front of it, pressed by instinct. They piled up against fences. Some pushed through. The survivors were thin and disoriented when the blizzard broke. Then came the 9th of January, 1887. The temperature was already at minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit across wide areas of Montana when the wind shifted and pushed the Arctic air south. At Bismarck, the mercury dropped to minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit on January 9 and held near there on January 12. At Fort Keogh, the military post in eastern Montana, it reached minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit before the worst passed, the coldest formal temperature ever measured in the continental United States to that point. Cowboys on the LX Ranch in Montana reported skinning 250 carcasses per mile for 35 consecutive miles after the thaw. The national estimate for cattle losses in Montana alone approached 362,000 head. Some ranches lost 90% of their herds. The open-range cattle industry, the industry that had been described just 2 years earlier as the most certain path to wealth in the American West, effectively ended in the winter of 1886 to 87. Theodore Roosevelt lost 2 of his 3 ranches and wrote to Henry Cabot Lodge that there had been a perfect smash-up all through the cattle country of the Northwest. He never went back to ranching seriously. In Ellis County, Kansas, the stock losses were severe, but the human losses were contained. The settlers who had been there since the mid-1870s, the Volga Germans and the American homesteaders who'd learned from them or alongside them, had stone walls. Most of their stone walls, by 1887, had interior plaster, though not all. Some still had bare stone interiors. It was easy enough to tell them apart by the week of January 9th. The families in the plastered stone houses kept manageable fires going and waited. Interior temperatures dropped all the way down to perhaps 45 degrees Fahrenheit in the worst nights, but held there and stabilized. The families in the bare stone houses burned through their wood supplies in the first 48 hours trying to chase a temperature they couldn't catch. The cold air moving through the walls was negating every BTU the fire produced. The families in log cabins had a different problem. Their walls insulated better than bare stone, but were lighter. The walls held almost no thermal mass. Every time the fire died down to sleep, to conserve fuel, to deal with anything, the temperature crashed. Log walls with R10 lose heat fast when there's nothing in them to slow the cooling. The heat that's been pumped into the room all day is mostly in the air, and when you stop adding heat, the air temperature falls immediately. The stone walls that were properly finished sealed inside with lime plaster were doing something the log walls couldn't. They were releasing stored heat. This is the physics, and it needs a moment. R value measures resistance to heat flow through a material. It's a static measurement. It tells you how fast a wall moves heat from one side to the other when temperatures on both sides are steady and constant. But temperature is never steady and constant. Outside, temperature swings. The fire goes up and down. The sun hits the south wall for 6 hours and disappears. These swings are where stone does something wood cannot match. Limestone has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 33.5 British thermal units per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit. Softwood is around 13.5, meaning per cubic foot, limestone stores about 2.5 times as much heat as an equivalent volume of wood. Scale that up to a 2-inch wall, much thicker than any log structure, and a typical square foot of Schreiber's wall face could store roughly 67 British thermal units per degree Fahrenheit. The physics term for what happens next is thermal time lag. Heat hitting the exterior face of a thick stone wall doesn't emerge immediately at the interior face. It travels through the stone slowly. The thermal diffusivity of limestone is exceptionally low compared to other building stones, between 0.5 and 1 × 10 to the power of -6 square meters per second. For a 2-inch wall, the calculated time lagged the delay between a temperature change on the outside and its arrival at the inside face runs somewhere between 8 and 14 hours. That number changes everything about how the wall behaves. During the day, the fire burns. The south wall absorbs heat from direct radiation and warm interior air. That heat is slowly moving into the stone. It won't emerge on the cold exterior face for 8 to 14 hours. The stone is absorbing it, holding it, storing it. At night, when the fire is banked and the outside temperature plunges to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the stored heat in the walls begins releasing slowly, gently, at the interior face, back into the room. The wall is giving back what it took during the warmer period. The time lag phase shifts the cold. The coldest exterior temperature arrives at the interior wall surface not in the middle of the night when the fire is low, but somewhere in the middle of the following day, when the fire is burning and solar gain is working and the family can compensate. Here, though, is the critical qualification, the one that explains everything about the plaster. All of that thermal mass performance, the storage, the time lag, the phase shifting, requires the wall to be dry. Wet stone is a radically different material than dry stone. Water in the pore spaces of limestone can conduct heat 2 to 3 times faster than dry limestone. A damp wall doesn't store heat efficiently. It conducts it. The thermal mass effect collapses. And the single most effective way to keep a stone wall dry from the inside is to seal the interior face so that warm, humid interior air cannot infiltrate the wall system, condense on the cold stone surfaces within the wall thickness, and saturate the mortar joints. The lime plaster does both jobs at once. It seals the air movement, eliminating that 5 to 40% infiltration loss the National Park Service identified, and it keeps the wall dry, preserving the thermal mass performance that makes the whole system work. Without the plaster, you have a porous stone wall that loses heat through air infiltration and whose internal stone stays damp from condensation, destroying what little thermal mass benefit might otherwise exist. With the plaster, you have an airtight, dry, massive wall that stores heat during warm periods and releases it slowly during cold ones, with a natural time lag that protects occupants from the worst nighttime lows. The difference in interior temperature between these two systems during a sustained -40 degrees Fahrenheit event isn't trivial. Documented comparisons from SPAB field studies on 19th century stone buildings found that properly finished stone walls, lime mortared, lime plastered, performed 20 to 40% better than their calculated R values predicted. In absolute terms, over a severe cold event, that performance gap translates to 25 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit of interior temperature difference, which is why one family was sitting by a small fire at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, while their neighbor, in a structurally identical-looking house a quarter-mile away, was fighting to keep the room above freezing. Now come the neighbors who copied. Karl Adler, whose plaster Schreiber had rebuilt in 1886, survived the great dye-up winter in reasonable comfort. He knew why. He told his brother-in-law Friedrich Hausmann about the plaster. Hausmann built a stone house in 1887, the spring after the bad winter, using fence-post limestone from the same outcrop Schreiber used. He mixed lime mortar. He built the walls 20 inches thick. He got the basic architecture right. He did not plaster the interior, not because he forgot, not because he thought it was a bad idea, but because he watched Schreiber's wall and made a judgment call that the plaster was aesthetic rather than functional. He'd been in the house. The walls were nice and smooth and white. That was the point, he thought, to make the interior look finished. And he'd heard from some of the American neighbors that plaster was just what you did in a fancy house, not a working house. He skipped it. By the first hard week of the following November, Hausmann's house was 10 degrees Fahrenheit colder than Schreiber's, despite identical construction in every other way, and he was burning 40% more wood. He came back to Schreiber in December. "The walls are the same walls," he said. "I counted. Your courses, my courses. Same stone, same lime, same thickness. Why is your house warm and mine is not?" Schreiber walked through Hausmann's house slowly. He pressed his hand flat against the interior stone face. Cold. You could feel air moving along the surface in some places. He looked at the mortar joints. They were good. No major gaps. "Go get me a candle," he said. He held the lit candle close to the wall face, moved it slowly along the joints. In several places, the flame deflected, cold air moving through. You couldn't see the gap. You could barely feel it with your hand, but the flame saw it. "Every joint," Schreiber said. "Every one. Air is moving through every joint. The wall looks solid. It is not solid." He came back in January with lime putty and plastered Hausmann's interior over 4 days. The change was immediate, not gradual, not measurable, only with a thermometer. The family felt it the day the last section was finished, and the plaster started to carbonate. The drafts stopped. The room held its heat overnight. The fire, the same fire, same wood, same grate, produced a warmth that seemed to fill the room differently than it had before. Hausmann described it, in the account passed down through his family, as the difference between wearing a coat and standing in a warm room. The coat had been working, he said, but the room was better. What the neighbors copied was the shape of the thing, the visible thing, the stone walls, the limestone courses, the lime mortar, the dimensions, the weight, the permanence. What they missed was the finishing step that made the visible thing function. You can build the correct wall and still lose if you stop before the last step. This isn't unique to stone construction. It's a pattern that repeats across almost every thermal system where the critical element is invisible. Consider the Mandan Earth Lodge, because the Mandan had solved this exact problem centuries before Johann Schreiber or any European settler set foot on the Kansas plains. The Mandan villages along the Missouri River, in what is now North Dakota, had been occupied continuously, in some cases since roughly 900 AD. Their earth lodges circular, timber-framed, covered with layers of willow branches, dried grass, and thick sod housed families of 10 to 20 people through winters that routinely reached 40 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Lewis and Clark wintered at Fort Mandan in 1804 to 05. Their own log fort was built on the east bank of the Missouri. The Mandan village Mitutanka was visible across the frozen river. Members of the expedition frequently walked across the ice to the Mandan lodges for warmth and company. This is documented in Patrick Gass's journal. The expedition's own fort, which they built and controlled, was apparently less comfortable than the lodges of their Mandan hosts. George Catlin visited the Mandan in 1832 and described the interior in detail. Prince Maximilian of Wied-Neuwied and artist Karl Bodmer spent the winter of 1833–34 inside these lodges and produced the first detailed visual records of their interior arrangement. Maximilian wrote about sleeping alcoves that were warm enough to shed outer garments even in the coldest nights. The Mandan Lodge was a thermal mass system, but a sophisticated one. The floor was dug 12 to 24 inches below grade, tapping the stable ground temperature roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round in that latitude as a thermal buffer. The roof carried tons of earth, the storage mass. The entry tunnel, 6 to 15 feet long and facing south or east, served as a thermal airlock. Cold exterior air had to navigate the full length of the tunnel before entering the lodge, losing temperature the entire way. That tunnel is their lime plaster, the invisible functional step, the one that makes the mass work. When European settlers looked at the earth lodge and tried to understand why it was warm, they talked about the earth roof, the thickness, the mass. They were right, but they were looking at the wrong part. The mass without the airlock was nothing. The airlock was the critical layer. The earth lodge, the Schreiber house, and every passive thermal mass system that has ever worked all depend on the same principle. First, stop the air. Then let the mass do its work. The Building Research Establishment in the UK ran formal field studies on 18th and 19th century stone buildings in the 1990s and 2000s. They were trying to understand why energy performance models consistently underestimated how well old stone buildings worked. They expected to find bad performance. The R values were terrible by modern standards, and instead found, repeatedly, buildings that performed measurably better than the math said they should. Colin King at the BRE identified the key factor: dryness. Solid walls, if they are dry, don't lose a lot of heat, he said. The thicker they are, the less they lose. You lose heat rapidly if it is damp. The Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, measuring 73 traditionally finished stone buildings across Wales, Scotland, and northern England, found that the consistently better performers shared three characteristics: lime mortar rather than cement, lime plaster on interior faces rather than cement render or bare stone, and no vapor barriers added during modernization that trapped moisture inside the wall assembly. The ones that performed worst were the ones that had been improved. Cement mortar repointed into the joints, cement render applied to the exterior, spray foam pumped into cavities. Every one of these interventions made the wall trap moisture. Damp stone conducts heat fast. Thermally massive damp stone is just a cold, slow-draining battery. The buildings that performed best were the ones that had never been touched. Old lime mortar, old lime plaster, walls breathing as they were designed to breathe. Oak Ridge National Laboratory, in its Southwest Thermal Mass Study at Tesuque Pueblo in New Mexico, testing 8 buildings with different wall assemblies, including 2-foot thick. Adobe found that the massive earthen buildings tracked closely to steady-state thermal performance predictions when they were properly finished and dry, but diverged sharply when moisture was introduced. A damp adobe wall performed roughly 60% worse than a dry one of identical thickness. The physics was the same in every case. Dry, massive, sealed walls worked. Wet, porous, unsealed walls didn't. The log cabin's problem is different from both, and worth understanding on its own terms. A properly chinked log wall is reasonably airtight. The R values are genuine, and the insulation performs as advertised, but a log wall is light. The volumetric heat capacity of softwood is roughly 13.5 British thermal units per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit, less than half of limestone. An 8-inch log wall stores perhaps 9 British thermal units per degree per square foot of wall face. Schreiber's 2-inch limestone wall was storing roughly 67. That's a thermal mass ratio of more than 7 to 1. What this means in practice: When the fire dies at midnight, at 3 a.m., during a fuel shortage, the log cabin's temperature begins dropping almost immediately, because the room itself is where all the heat lives. Think of a log cabin like a small gas tank. It holds some fuel, it runs, it empties fast. The stone house is more like a reservoir. It doesn't fill as quickly, but once it's full, it takes a long time to empty. The difference breaks down like this. The log cabin isn't storing heat in its walls. It's the room air that's storing the heat. And room air has almost no thermal capacity. The moment you stop adding heat, the air temperature falls fast, and the walls don't hold it back. During normal winters, this isn't a fatal problem. You bank the fire, you wake up cold, you rebuild it. But during a sustained Arctic event, when temperatures don't recover during daylight, when fuel is running short, when you can't leave the house to get more wood because the wind will kill you before you reach the woodpile, the log cabin's fragility becomes serious. People who documented the winter of 188, 687 inches log structures consistently described the experience as chasing warmth they couldn't catch. The fire would get the room to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. They'd bank it at midnight. By 4 a.m., it was 28 degrees Fahrenheit inside. The stone house absorbs insults. It stores heat from yesterday. It releases heat tonight. Even if the fire goes completely cold for a few hours or half a day, the walls are still radiating. The room cools slowly, held by 22 inches of limestone that has been drinking warmth for 2 days. A cattle rancher who lost half his herd in January 1887 wrote in a letter, "The cold seemed to hold. It didn't come and go like an ordinary cold. It just stayed. A man couldn't get warm in his cabin because every time the fire burned down a little, the cold had already been in the walls, and the walls gave it back. He was in a log cabin. He was describing exactly what thermal mass does in reverse. A light wall with no storage gave back cold the moment the fire ebbed, and he didn't have enough mass to buffer the event. 1/4 mile from where men were shivering in log cabins that January, families in properly finished limestone houses were doing what the Mandan had been doing for 900 years on the northern Missouri, waiting it out in walls that remembered warmer days and gave the warmth back slowly, measured in degrees per hour rather than in a crash. The story of Johann Schreiber's house comes to its end in the summer of 1888. That year, 18 months after the Great Die-Up, was when the construction in Ellis County changed. Not dramatically, not with announcements, but the neighbors who had copied the stone walls without the plaster began replastering. Housemen had already done it. 4 other families that Schreiber could name replastered their interiors between spring and fall. 1,888. One family, the Wagners, who'd built in 1884 with bare interior stone, hired Schreiber directly, paid him in a load of quarried limestone, and stood with him while he worked so they could see the technique. None of them described the change as a revelation. None of them wrote down anything like, "We finally understood." They just plastered their walls. The community knowledge adjusted without fanfare. The thing that worked, worked. The thing that didn't, got fixed. What nobody wrote down because nobody needed to write it down, because everyone who was there already knew was the gap between what the wall looked like and what the wall actually did. The neighbor had seen Schreiber's wall for 12 years. He'd touched it, leaned against it, been inside the house in February. He knew it was warm. He copied the stones, the mortar, the thickness, the layout, and he missed 3/4 of an inch of white paste on the interior face. That gap between what we see and what does the work is a surprisingly consistent feature of thermal systems. It's the same gap that caused the BRE researchers to be wrong about old stone buildings for 20 years. They measured the R values. They built models. The models said cold. The buildings said warm. The models were measuring the visible structure. The buildings were being kept warm by the invisible finishing layer. It's the same gap that killed cattle and cowboys in January 1887, while Schreiber's family sat by a modest fire. The ranchers had looked at shelter and thought about thickness, weight, timber quality. They hadn't thought about what was filling the microscopic gaps in their walls, or whether there was anything filling them at all. And it's the same gap that the Mandan understood intuitively, not because they had engineering degrees, but because they had been building for long enough that the one element that made everything else work was the first thing they thought about: the entry tunnel, the airlock. Stop the air before you think about anything else. The researchers at Oak Ridge and the BRE eventually reached the same conclusion, from data and experiment, that settlers on the Kansas plains reached by trial and error, and that the Mandan had encoded into their building practice centuries before any of them were born. Seal the wall against air movement. Keep the wall dry. Let the mass do its work. 3 steps, in that order, every time. There's one more layer to this, and it's the layer that makes the whole system make sense at a mechanistic level rather than just an intuitive one. When lime plaster cures, it doesn't dry the way paint dries. It carbonates. The lime paste calcium hydroxide reacts with carbon dioxide in the air, slowly and continuously, converting to calcium carbonate over months to years. The final material is slightly porous and vapor permeable, but not air permeable. Vapor water molecules in gaseous form can move slowly through it, but bulk air movement cannot. This distinction is why lime plaster works and cement render often doesn't. Cement is nearly impermeable to both vapor and air, so it traps moisture inside the wall, wetting the stone from within. Lime plaster lets the wall breathe moisture out as vapor while keeping the wind-driven air infiltration out. The wall stays dry, and the moisture management is built into the material. Beyond that, lime plaster has a small but real self-healing property. As the carbonation process continues, as long as the plaster is intact, and the wall moves slightly with temperature change, causing micro cracks, fresh calcium hydroxide migrates to the cracks and reseals them. Not perfectly, not indefinitely, but measurably. A lime-plastered wall maintains its air seal better over decades than a cement-rendered or bare stone wall, because the material is slowly repairing itself. Schreiber's grandfather knew none of this chemistry. He'd never heard of carbonation or calcium hydroxide or vapor permeability. He knew that lime plaster lasted and cement, where available, cracked and failed. He knew that the walls plastered by his grandfather's generation were still tight and warm, and that was sufficient. The mechanism didn't require explanation to be used correctly. The frontier builders who got it right didn't get it right because they understood the physics. They got it right because they inherited a practice that had been refined by generations of people living in cold places with stone walls, who kept the things that worked and discarded the things that didn't. The knowledge was embedded in the technique before the technique was explained. When Friedrich Hausmann built his stone house in 1887 and skipped the plaster, he didn't lack intelligence. He lacked transmission of a specific practical tradition. The knowledge existed in Schreiber's hands and in Schreiber's grandfather's memory, but it hadn't been communicated as a principle, only as a step. And a step without a reason is easy to skip when you're tired and behind on winter preparations, and the wall looks fine already. This is how old knowledge dies, not in catastrophic loss, but in skipped steps, in the reasonable judgment of someone who looked at the visible result and couldn't see why the finishing mattered. Today, the oldest surviving stone buildings in post-rock country in Russell County, Ellis County, Lincoln County, and Rush County in Kansas are mostly the ones that were lime mortared and lime plastered. The ones finished in cement from the early 20th century onward, when Portland cement became cheap and widely available, have significantly higher rates of structural damage: cracked stone faces, deteriorating mortar joints, moisture-stained walls. The buildings that weren't improved are in better shape than the ones that were. The Mennonite Stone Orphanage at Inman, built in 1893, used lime mortar. John Mueller's limestone house in Dodge City, built 1879 to 81 with walls 24 inches thick and lime mortared throughout, still stands today. John Fenton Pratt's stone house in Sheridan County, built in 1885 with fence post limestone and a sod roof that was later replaced with wood, remains one of the oldest intact buildings in northwest Kansas. These walls are not remarkable because of their thickness or their stone. They're remarkable because whoever built them understood that the stone was half the system, the half you could see. The other half, the lime, the plaster, the sealed interior face, is the half that nobody noticed until it was missing. There's something worth saying about how knowledge works, because the pattern here isn't unique to stone walls. It repeats whenever a skill passes from one person to the next through demonstration rather than explanation. When Schreiber plastered his walls, he wasn't explaining carbonation chemistry or vapor permeability or thermal mass activation. He was following a sequence his grandfather had taught him. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. The reason for Step 3 wasn't articulated, it was just what you did next. And that made Step 3 the vulnerable step, because a person watching from the outside could see Steps 1 and 2 clearly, judge them to be the important ones, and decide that Step 3 was optional. Every craft has a Step 3. Every traditional building practice, every old technique that worked for centuries before anyone could explain why somewhere in it there is a step that looks optional and isn't. A step that is invisible in its function, that produces no immediate visible result, that a reasonable observer would skip when pressed for time or short on materials, or simply unconvinced of its necessity. When the BRE and SPAB researchers finally published their findings on traditional stone building performance in the early 2000s, the core recommendation was something a Volga German stonemason on the Kansas plains could have told them in 1877. Use lime, not cement. Plaster the interior. Keep the wall dry. Let it breathe. Johann Schreiber didn't know he was doing building science. He was doing what his grandfather taught him, in a limestone country he'd never seen before, with tools he'd made himself, for a winter he couldn't have imagined in Russia. The wall held, and when it held on the 9th of January 1887, when the temperature outside was 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cattle were already dead against the wire, and Theodore Roosevelt was getting the letter that would end his ranching career when all of that was happening, a family in Ellis County, Kansas, was sitting around a small fire in a warm room because 3/4 of an inch of white lime paste, invisible on the interior face of a stone wall, was doing something that 6 inches of solid log simply couldn't. The neighbors saw the stone. They always see the stone. The stone is not the secret.